Ben Shapiro is wrong about transgenderism. Ben Shapiro will sometimes claim that his anti-transgender arguments and viewpoints are grounded in biology and science, pointing to things like chromosomes, and ultimately, the case that he makes is that the science proves his position and backs what he's saying. For example, here's what Shapiro said in a panel about transgenderism.
It turns out that every chromosome, every cell in Caitlyn Jenner's body is male with the exception of some of his sperm cells.
And he also said the following in one of his famous Owning the Libs videos.
But if you are going to dictate to me that I'm supposed to pretend that men are women and women are men, no. My answer is no. I'm not going to modify basic biology because it threatens your subjective sense of what you are.
Now, it's important to distinguish here between two different things. The internal, cognitive, or psychological experience and state that a person has, and their chromosomes. There's no necessary biological reason that the two necessarily must be 100% correlated with one another. Because, the case conservatives make is it's like, somebody who's born a male at birth has the male chromosomes. And so logically from that, the argument they make is therefore the internal psychological cognitive state of this person must also be male and correspond to what the chromosomes are. And, really there's just so much more to psychology and cognition and conscious experience than just your mere chromosomes. Like, there can be genetic factors that play a role, there can be epigenetic factors, there can be developmental factors, environmental factors, cultural factors, and just to look at the chromosomes and be like, your psychological state must always, therefore, perfectly correlate with that. There's really no psychological or biological or neurological reason why that's necessarily the case. Regarding transgenderism specifically, the American Psychiatric Association, they claim that some of the contributing factors that actually lead some people to become transgender could be genetic influences, sometimes it could be prenatal hormone levels, sometimes early experiences in life, likely some combination of all three of these factors. And what they don't claim is, your psychological state must 100% correspond to, the chromosomes that you have, and therefore the psychological state must go with it. There's really no reason for there to be that sort of 100% congruence like that, or to demand this sort of perfect alignment between the two. We're talking about cognition here, perception, psychology, brain development. And, to reduce this really complex part of the human experience and, brain development and all that shit to just 100% it must match up with your chromosomes. Biologically, there's no reason for this. And, brain science and psychology, it's generally much more complicated than that. A good analogy for understanding this is to look at homosexuality. Because you can't genetically confirm a homosexual psychological state. Like, somebody tells you he's gay and he's attracted to men. You can't sequence his genome and be like, yep, there's the gay gene. And so therefore, yes, we can accept the validity of your homosexual experience and your attraction. You also wouldn't be able to predict it from the parents of this person, because oftentimes there are two heterosexual parents. So it's not like, well, you're the offspring of one of the parents is gay or whatever. And so therefore, it makes sense biologically that the descendant would also have these traits. So the point is there's nothing genetic you can point to validate this experience. So all we really have to go off of is, number one, the reported internal experience that they tell us, where they say, they tell us, yeah, I'm attracted to dudes versus women, and this is my experience. And then number two, there's also the fact that they act in accordance with it. They don't just make the claim, they also live as a homosexual. Like, they suck penises and get fucked in the ass and stuff like that. Pretty powerful confirmatory evidence. I mean, you want to talk about hard evidence, And then number three is the psychological community, the medical experts, the psychological experts. They then come out and say, yes, this is normal, it's healthy, it's non-pathological, and it's a valid experience that they're having. And for most of us, this is enough. There are some homosexual deniers out there who reject homosexuality, and they say, you're not actually gay, you're just a sinner, it's just Satan has polluted your minds, and, really deep down, you're a heterosexual, and you just need to pray the gay away. For the most part, these people don't have much currency in society these days. Most of us, if someone tells us they're gay, they live as a gay person, and the psychological community is like, yeah, homosexuality, it's a thing that's valid. For most of us, we accept it, and we're just like, yeah, of course. And the circumstances are actually very similar for transsexualism, where you wouldn't predict the internal state from just looking at the genome, because you look at the chromosomes and you're like, there's nothing in the chromosomes that would lead us to necessarily believe that a person would have this internal state. There's nothing you can point to there. Same with the sex orientation or gender orientation of the parents, where it's like neither parent is transgender, so you wouldn't predict it from that in terms of like heritability. But similar to homosexuals, like what we just saw, number one, they report the internal experience to us. They say, this is the way I feel, and this is the experience I have. Number two, they act very strongly in accordance with it in terms of gender reassignment surgery and like hormone treatment and things of that nature. And then number three, the psychological experts, the medical community, they come out and say, yes, this is normal. It's a valid, healthy experience. There's nothing mentally ill or pathological about it. And they say that it's totally fine. So really it's very similar to homosexuality in that sense, where the same, three criteria points that we use to accept homosexuality, they're there for transsexuality as well. So it's like, if there's no solid foundation for rejecting it in the case of homosexuals, you wouldn't go up to a gay person and be like, I don't think you actually are attracted to men. I think you're lying about it. For the most part, most of us accept what they tell us based on those three criteria points. Why not do the same for transsexuals is the question that I have. Now, the Republican, Ben Shapiro, he almost certainly wouldn't have a problem, or he wouldn't deny or argue with the fact that, number one, yes, transgender people are having the internal experience. Shapiro doesn't claim that transgender people are lying about it, He also probably wouldn't argue with the fact that they're acting strongly in accordance with it when they get gender reassignment surgery. His argument would basically just be, yeah, they believe this and they act in accordance with it, but it's a mental illness, it's delusions. And this is something that he says quite explicitly. So really that's the one thing that he would disagree with, is whether it actually is a psychologically healthy and normal and valid internal experience to have. That would be his point of disagreement. And the thing is, it's not his fucking decision to make. Like the medical community, the psychologists, the experts, the researchers who study this field and specialize in this, the PhDs and the fucking researchers who look at different mental and psychological states and make the determinations as to what's pathological, what's delusional, what's a mental illness, what's a normal, healthy state. There are fucking experts and people who work in this field, and they're the ones that decide this shit. It's not Ben Shapiro that decides this for the world. And so the consensus among all these professionals, all the top organizations and top experts, whether we're talking the American Psychiatric Association, American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, the consensus among all of them is it is a mentally healthy and valid and normal and non-delusional mental state. So really the only grounds on which Ben Shapiro disagrees with the validity of transsexualism is on a criteria point that all the relevant experts and organizations in this field just flatly contradict what he's saying. So now that we've accepted, number one, the internal experience of transgender people, we accept that they're having the internal experience of transgenderism. Now that we've accepted, number two, that they're acting in accordance with it by undergoing gender reassignment surgery and hormone therapy and so forth, we've accepted, number three, the psychological community, the mental health community, the medical community, all these top relevant organizations, they all agree that it's healthy and it's normal and it's not indicative of mental illness for those people. And we've accepted, number four, these expert organizations are much more reliable and trustworthy sources of information on this question than right-wing radio host Ben Shapiro. All we're really left with this at this point is just the technical semantic conversation of definitions, labels. What terminology are we going to specifically use? And this is like the last remaining bastion that conservatives have left to hide inside of. And fundamentally, this is one of the big sticking points for them, where it's just like, what is the definition of a man versus a woman? Sometimes Shapiro, he makes arguments along these lines where, to sort of back his case on this, he'll say things like, you can't claim to be something you're not. For example, you can't change your age.
Dan, why? Okay, let me ask you this. I won't ask you how old. I will ask you how old you are. Okay, because you're young enough that it's probably not insulting to ask you. So
I'm 22, so I'm probably young and naive, right?
No. Why aren't you 60? Why aren't you 60?
Because it.
And why? Why can't you identify as 60? What is the problem with you identifying as 60?
And, this is one of those videos that definitely went viral, and a lot of people just love this clip, and they're like, yes, you're fucking 23 years old, you can't claim that you're 60. Like, transgenderism, debunked. And then sometimes you'll have Republicans make a bunch of other silly analogies where they're like, oh, you identify as a woman, even though you were born biologically male? Well, I identify as an attack helicopter. And they all just applaud each other and just have a good laugh about it. And I'm just like, dude, the difference is the claims that you're making in these analogies, none of them are being made in good faith. Like, a transgender person isn't claiming to have their internal experience to try to make a clever point or to try to own the libs at a Q&A session. It's like, this is their actual internal experience that they're having. And it's not just like a funny thing they're saying to try to be clever. And, it's not just that they're having the experience, but it's also an experience that's validated by the medical community and the psychological community as totally appropriate and healthy and normal for these people. And, to compare that to just like, I identify as an attack helicopter. I mean, like, it's really fucking silly, and it's really juvenile, and it's not a claim that anyone is making in good faith. So it's just like, why don't we cut the shit with the stupid fucking analogies and just talk about what we're actually talking about? Now, a good way to illustrate the absurdity of the conservative position, specifically regarding the chromosomes argument, where they say, male chromosomes, it's a man forever. Female chromosomes, it's a woman forever, end of conversation. If you look at the case of hermaphrodites or intersexuals, it really puts them in an awkward position where their arguments just really kind of fall apart. Hermaphrodites, these are people who are actually born with both the male and the female sex chromosomes, and also both the male and the female sex organs. So, you'll have somebody who they're born and they don't fall into the one or the two categories. They have both chromosomes of both sexes. And what typically ends up happening is they tend to go down one of the two gender paths. Sometimes the parents, based upon which genitals predominate when they're very young, they tend to just sort of push them down that one. Oftentimes the parents just allow them to decide when they're older which one kind of conforms better to their experience and feels best for them. And this is actually very similar to what happens with transsexuals, because they have two sets of chromosomes. So you wouldn't necessarily predict that they would have one internal experience that predominates. But typically that's actually what happens with intersexuals, where it's like, they may have been born with both sexual organs, but you'll have a certain intersexual individual who internally they feel like a woman, and it's just like that's their internal state, and so they end up going down that path. And you would look at the chromosomes and you wouldn't predict this from the internal experience, but this is what ends up happening with them, just because, like I said earlier, the psychology, the conscious experience of the internal state, it's separate from the chromosomes, because there's more that goes into psychology than just your fucking chromosomes. And so really intersexuals, I think, are a good bridge to sort of understand this incongruence between a person's sex at birth and the gender identity that they have internally. Because, here it's the same thing, you're looking at the chromosomes, but there's just an incongruence that's very similar to what we see with transsexuals. So if it's acceptable and valid and normal and healthy for intersexuals, why not transsexuals as well, is a question that I have. And I think probably the more important point about this is that it actually just completely inverts the Republican logic and just makes them look really fucking stupid. Because the case they make is, you look at the chromosomes and that's how you decide what to call a person or what their gender is. So by that logic, shouldn't Republicans view hermaphrodites as both simultaneously a man and a woman? Because, that's the criteria they use here. What are they going to do in terms of names? Like, if they have a coworker who transitions from a born biological male to a woman, and they're like, I used to be Sheldon, I'd like you to call me Shelby now. And, they tend to resist this and use the male name. But it's like, what the fuck are they going to do for a hermaphrodite? Are they going to do, like, a combined male-female name, where it's like, I'm going to call you Shelby Sheldon? Gender pronouns, are they going to use the term he, she, he, where it's like, where's he, she at right now? I think he, she is on his, her lunch break, Because again, that's the fucking logic they use here, is the pronouns need to correspond to the chromosomes. Then you get into shit like the bathroom argument, or the locker room arguments. What fucking bathroom are these people going to use? It's like, is Ben Shapiro going to say that you need to take a dump in the men's room, but wash your hands in the fucking women's room? Like, you can shower in the men's locker room, but I insist that you towel off in the women's room, because you're both a male and a fucking woman. So really the point of this is the same logic that they use to try to illustrate how transgenderism is silly, because look at all these conclusions about the gender pronouns and the implications of that. Really the same logic and criteria that they use here kind of turns the point they're making on its head. Because all the silly shit that they claim is ridiculous, the pronouns and, the policies about like bathrooms and locker rooms, their criteria and logic forces them to do the same kind of shit that they claim is ridiculous. I would also invite you to ask if chromosomes are fundamentally what it even comes down to for Republicans like Ben Shapiro on this. I think a good way to investigate this is just to ask, generally speaking, what is the right-wing response to transvestites versus transsexuals? Transvestites, this is somebody also known as cross-dressers. It's somebody who they don't necessarily identify as a woman. Like, their internal state might not necessarily be like, yeah, I feel like a woman trapped in a man's body. It's just, you might just have a guy who likes to just put on a dress every now and then and just dress up like a woman, like Steven Crowder does. And, you look at transvestites and it's just like, they're not claiming to actually be the opposite gender. So on the basis of this Ben Shapiro chromosomal argument, presumably that means that Republicans are going to welcome transvestites with open arms and say, it's totally fine, dude. You want to put a fucking dress on? As long as you're not making claims about your chromosomes, I'm cool with it, and we can be friends, and I fully accept you. Is that what Republicans do, or do they treat transvestites with the same sort of disdain and ridicule that they do transsexuals? I think we all know the answer to this. So with that in mind, I would just sort of invite you to ask yourself, like, does this really come down to the detailed nuances of genetics and chromosomes for them? Like that fucking Republican posting a comment on a YouTube video about genetics and chromosomes. I mean, honestly, how many fucking books on genetics do you think that guy owns? Does it really come down to, I just have such a deep and abiding passion for the detailed nuances of genetic science? Is that what it is? Or is it just transgenders and transvestites kind of creep them out and freak them out a little bit? And so they kind of decide that they don't like them, and then they work backwards from that position. Again, in my opinion, the case of transvestites makes pretty clear what the answer is. Now, Republicans, they'll also make arguments like, look, you're saying to me there's a person who can feel internally like a woman, even though they have a penis. Ben Shapiro, he'll harp on the penis. I mean, this guy's obsessed with the penis. It's a little, you want to talk pathological. He's always talking about, like, the internal state as a woman, but this person has a penis, and that's not ridiculous to you? And I'm just like, dude, I don't think you understand that's literally what transgenderism is. Like, transgenderism is literally the incongruence between a person's sex at birth and, like, the outward physical fucking shell that they have, and the internal state of what they, what gender they feel like they are. That's why they use the fucking term woman trapped in a man's body to explain this. So, like, it's not news to anybody for you to point out, like, this person, they identify as a woman and feel like a woman, but they have a penis. It's like, that's not news to anybody. That person's not going to look down and be like, what the fuck? Where did that come from? Like, he's right. There's a penis there. Like, this isn't news to the medical or psychological community. That's a literal description of what transgenderism is. It's that incongruence between the psychological perception of what gender they are and then the outward fucking shell that they have. And that's the whole point of gender reassignment surgery in hormone therapy. It's to correct and reconcile that incongruence, to sort of bridge that disconnect. And I really think the conservative position on this just comes down to their fundamental inability to just empathize with other people on this. And I don't mean that in the sense of like a jab in a YouTube video where it's like, Republicans are mean. I mean the literal definition of empathize, where it's like to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and positions and like think about and understand their experience as opposed to yours. Because a lot of the Republicans that make these arguments, especially on YouTube, it's for whatever reason, a lot of fucking political viewers on subjects like these are mostly male. And so what you have is a person who's a straight man And that's his experience, where it's like, I have a male body and I have a male personality. And this is my experience, where it's like, I have the dick and I have the male mindset to go with it, where I like sports and, you know, attractive women turn me on and shit. And it's like, they have that congruence. And so for them to imagine anything other than this, they look at that and they're like, that's mental illness. That's a delusion. But transgenderism, it doesn't fucking work the way that their mind and their body works. You know, again, transgenderism is literally that fucking incongruence, where it's like a woman trapped in a man's body. So, I mean, honestly, for a lot of these people who reject transgenderism, if they would just stop and just fucking think for a second, like, what would this really actually be like? Like, imagine you're a guy with a heterosexual male mindset. You've lived your whole fucking life that way. What if you woke up tomorrow, like, actually imagine this. What if you woke up tomorrow, same personality, same memories, same experiences, but for whatever fucking reason, you wake up in some parallel universe where you have a female woman's body. And you're the same person, same personality, and you're just like, dude, I'm not in the right fucking body. Like, I'm a man, but I'm in this outward female shell. That's basically what the experience of transgenderism is like for a lot of these individuals. And, you know, so regarding the definitions of like, well, what's your criteria for what a man actually is or what a woman actually is? For Republicans, what it comes down to for them is like, look at the chromosomes, look what they were born with. But for me, and for the medical community and the fucking psychologists and experts in this field, what it comes down to is just taking them at their word when they say, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. That's the experience they have, and it's an experience that I accept as valid, and it's one that the medical community and the psychological community accepts as well. It's just like, you know, a gay man tells you that he's attracted to men. I take him at his word that that's his experience, you know? Like, I don't need to probe inside of his fucking mind with a magnifying glass or try to pathologize it. I'm just like, okay, fine. Like, that's your fucking experience. I don't care. And, you know, when the medical and the psychological community agrees with this and says nothing wrong with it, it's not delusional, this is their actual fucking perception, then I'm just going to use the gender pronoun or the fucking name or the term that they identify with, and I'm just not going to be a fucking asshole about it. Another criteria that I like to use for this with thinking about, you know, the technical definitions of what's a man versus a woman, you know, what's the definitional criteria that you use here? A really good one that I think is helpful is literally who gives a fuck. Like, who gives a fuck? Mind your fucking business. That's my criteria. Like, who fucking cares? I mean, like, why do we need to inspect the fucking genitals of somebody before we have a conversation with them? Or decide, you know, what name to call them? Like, what do you have to gain here by just intentionally going out of your fucking way to be a dick about it? You know, these are people, they just want to live their life and just mind their fucking business. They're not going to stick their fucking trans penis in your mouth. They certainly don't want to spend any time around your fucking right-wing ass. They literally just want to live their life and mind their business. And for me, it's the same with names and gender pronouns and all of that shit. It's like somebody who used to be named Shelby wants to be called Sheldon. Who fucking cares? Somebody, you know, I used to go by he. I'd like to go by she now. Like, literally, dude, who fucking cares? It's the same number of syllables. It doesn't impact your life in any way. Like, it's a fucking word. It's a name. It's just like, this is the hill you're going to die on. Quibbling about semantics and definitions like this. I'm just like, honestly, dude, just who fucking cares? That's another criteria that I think we should use on this. And, you know, somebody tells me, use this name, use this pronoun. I'm not going to argue with them. I'm not going to be a fucking asshole about it. I'm just going to identify them by the gender that they claim corresponds to their internal experience. And that's what it comes down to for me. And, you know, like, is there any better example of just bending over backwards and going out of your way to be a fucking asshole than just purposefully using the wrong gender pronoun? How's it going, sir? Just like, come on, dude. Like, what do you have to gain from that? Just being a fucking dick on purpose like that. Fundamentally, what this disagreement really comes down to regarding, you know, the definitions and labels of a man versus a woman is Republicans insist that the gender labels, they come from your outward physical shell, the physical body that you have, the sex at birth, the chromosomes that you have, and for them, that's the fucking line they draw. But what the psychologists and the experts in this field tell us is that we should use the gender label that corresponds to that inward experience. And biologically, I would argue this makes sense because, like I pointed out, psychology and cognition are not necessarily 100% the product of your chromosomes. There doesn't need to be 100% correspondence because psychology and cognition, it's much more complicated than that. Other factors, genetics, developmental factors, they can play a role. So biologically, it makes sense to use the gender label that corresponds to this. And if you look at the reasons that Republicans refuse to use that gender label, the gender pronoun that a person identifies with, it's number one, they claim that a person's cognitive mental experience needs to correspond to their chromosomes, their outward physical traits. There's no reason for that. There's no psychological brain science justification for that. Number two, some of them reject the inward experience in terms of, claiming that it's delusional or pathological. And, number three, they flat out say that this is a mental illness and it's not a valid state. And on all three counts, they're just wrong about this. So what I would therefore contend is that also makes them wrong about which labels and which gender pronouns to use here. If you look out at the world, at, all the different people, all the different types of, psychological states and sexual states, there's a lot of variation. You have heterosexuals, you have homosexuals, you have bisexuals, you have asexuals, you have intersexuals. So my question is, why not also transsexuals? Why would it be so fucking hard to believe that this is also a mental psychological state when there's so much variety out there, so many different cognitive mental states? Like, why not this one also? What it really seems to come down to when you look at this right-wing resistance to accepting transgenders into this community, really what it seems to come down to is transgenders are just the newest ones to the party. And typical reactionary conservatism, anything that's new or different from what they're used to or from what their experience is, it's a typical reactionary and maybe even to a certain extent just a universal human response. Anything new, unusual, you've never seen it before, outside of your experience. Sometimes, people, it's gross to them, it's weird to them, it freaks them out, it makes them uncomfortable. And I think really a large part of the conservative viewpoint on the subject comes from that. And I would argue the case of transvestites versus transsexuals backs that up. 20, 30 years from now, transgenders, they're going to be much more accepted in society. And I really do think that we're going to look back on YouTube videos with titles like, Ben Shapiro destroys transgenderism. We're going to look back on videos like that as just as vile as if we saw a video today that was like, Ben Shapiro destroys homosexuality. Steven Crowder debunks lesbianism. I mean, if you saw something like that, you'd be like, what the fuck is this shit? Like, what are these idiots talking about? And I really do think that we're not going to be able to believe that there was this much hatred and ridicule and disdain for a group of people purely on the basis of their gender identity and an internal cognitive state that it's just their experience that they fucking have. And, people like Ben Shapiro, as smart as he thinks he is, 20, 30 years from now when society has moved forward and become much more accepting of transgenders, people like Shapiro, they're going to look really, really fucking stupid for having said and advocated these positions and done so publicly and so forcefully. So if there are any transgender people watching who are considering suicide, I would recommend that you stick around because you don't want to miss out on that. Trust me. This is one of many, many issues where Republicans, they're just on the wrong side of history and they're just behind the times. I'm on Patreon. There's a link in the bio if you'd like to support my content. I'd really appreciate it. You can also follow me on social media there. Links in the bio. If you want to help me build up some of those followings, I would appreciate it. Subscribe, hit the bell, you know the fucking drill. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this.